Hello everyone! Welcome to one of those white-pilling Friday videos where I leave you with some pretty decent news before we head into the weekend. Though obviously during the clown decade, good news tends to mean, oh, it turns out we were alright all along. So at least public opinion seems to be shifting back towards our favour. And my example of this is that lockdowns appear to be retroactively very unpopular, as we can see in the Fraser Nelson article on The Spectator with an interview with Rishi Sunak. The Lockdown Files, Rishi Sunak on what we weren't told. Now this is a bit of a mammoth of an article, so I'm going to try and pick out the most important bits. When Britain was being locked down, the country was assured that all risks had been properly and robustly considered. Yes, schools would close and education would suffer, normal healthcare would take a hit and people would die as a result. But the government repeatedly said the experts had looked at all this. After all, it wasn't as if they would lock us down without seriously weighing up the consequences, was it? Those consequences are still making themselves known. Exams madness, the NHS waiting list surge, thousands of unexplained excess deaths, judicial backlogs, and economic chaos. Was all that expected, factored in and thought of by leaders to be the price worth paying? Right at the start of lockdowns, ministers had already started to worry that the policy would be recklessly implemented without anyone thinking about side effects. Only a handful of key players at the very top made the decisions, among them Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor. It is now decided to go public on what happened. This is essentially soap operas for those of us that are political junkies. This stuff's great. Give me the governmental drama. I love it. When we met at the office that he has rented for his leadership campaign, soon to enter its final week, he says at the outset that he's not interested in pointing the finger at the fiercest proponents of lockdown. No one knew anything at the start, he says. Lockdown was by necessity a gamble. Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Advisor, would openly admit that lockdown could do more harm than good, but when the evidence started rolling in, a strange silence grew in government. Dissenting voices were filtered out, and see no evil policy was applied, which I can completely believe. Because generally the way modern governments seem to work is they just react to the media. And in the media these days, it's incredibly unfashionable to be someone like me, who is for free markets, who is for individual liberty, who is for basically allowing people to make their own decisions. A big example of a hot topic at the moment is gambling. Should gambling machines be allowed in pubs? Seems to be a big hot button topic, and I am of course on the side that pubs can have whatever they like in them. But people keep coming up with bad science and bad data to try and make the point that gambling is a terrible addiction that is putting a lot of people into poverty. It's generally not true. And of course, at the time in 2019 to 2020, the government was constantly faced with a media that was constantly letting people know that COVID-19 was going to be the next big killer. The bubonic plague times a million. And naturally, when you've got the media telling the population and politicians about this and that they are going to start having death tolls and are constantly saying that the government aren't doing anything, well, at the very least, the government wants to look like they're doing something. So anyone saying, oh, leave it, things will be fine, they will naturally have been filtered out. I can completely believe what Sunak is saying here. Sunak's story starts with the first COVID meeting, where ministers were shown an A3 poster from scientific advisors explaining the options. I wish I'd kept it because it listed things that had no impact. Banning live events and all that. He says, I was saying, you should be careful not to do this stuff too early because being able to sustain it is very hard in modern society. So the scientific advice was initially to reject or at least delay lockdown. This all changed when Neil Ferguson and his team at Imperial College published their famous Report 9, which argued that COVID casualties could hit 500,000 if no action was taken, but the figure could be below 20,000 if Britain locked down. And this is what I mean, the media was posting that everywhere, and so the government obviously has to react, otherwise they're killing apparently 480,000 people. That of course turned out to be a vast exaggeration of lockdown's ability to curb COVID deaths. Imperial stressed it did not consider the wider social and economic costs of suppression, which will be high, but surely someone involved in making the policy would figure it out. And that was the crux. No one really did. A cost-benefit calculation, a basic requirement for pretty much every public health intervention, was never made. It wasn't allowed to talk about the trade-off, says Sunak. Ministers were briefed by Number 10 on how to handle questions about side effects of lockdown. The script was not to ever acknowledge them. The script was, oh, there's no trade-off, because doing this for our health is good for the economy. And it's very strange that Rishi Sunak is constantly pointing fingers at this government saying, man, wasn't it bad, considering that he was not only part of the previous government, but he was also the Chancellor, i.e. the person who is supposed to say, hey, this is going to have massive economic impacts, let's not do this. And yet he didn't resign in protest, he doesn't seem to have done much, it's just, oh yeah, I put forward the trade-off benefit analysis and all that, but the rest of the department just didn't do anything about it. And this makes Rishi Sunak seem incredibly weak. If he thinks this is going to help his chances of becoming the next Conservative leader, I think he is gravely mistaken. He just looks like a massive pushover, which isn't ideal when you are trying to become the leader of an entire country. But as I say, this is a White Pill Friday, and this is in fact good news, because clearly Rishi Sunak's attempt to try and get at least the Conservative Party members on board and onto his side is basically to wink at all the lockdown skeptics, of which we have many more than we did during the lockdown, and say, hey, look, I was on your side throughout this. When really, as a result of his actions, the most he did was say eat out to help out and try and put stimulating economic policy in place like the furlough scheme, which in his defence was necessary because apparently the rest of the government was silencing him into doing it. Again, making him seem weak, but as I say, we're going on optics here, and the optics are clearly being a lockdown skeptic now it is a good thing. Unfortunately, it's about 2 years too late. If frank discussion was being suppressed externally, Sunak thought it all the more important that it took place internally, but that was not his experience. I felt like no one talked, he said. We didn't talk at all about missed doctors' appointments or the backlog building up in the NHS in a massive way. That was never part of it. When he did try to raise concerns, he met a brick wall. Those meetings were literally me around the table just fighting. It was incredibly uncomfortable every single time. He recalls one meeting where he raised education. I was very emotional about it. I was like, forget about the economy, surely we can agree that kids not being in school is a major nightmare, or something like that. There was a big silence afterwards. It was the first time someone had said it. I was so furious. One of Sunak's big concerns was about the fear messaging, which his Treasury team worried because of long-lasting effects. In every brief, we tried to say, let's stop the fear narrative. It was always wrong from the beginning. I constantly said it was wrong. The posters showing COVID patients on ventilators, he said, were the worst. It was wrong to scare people like that. The closest he came to defying this was a September 2020 speech saying that it was time to learn to live without fear, a direct response to the Cabinet Office's messaging. They were very upset about that. And again, it's all internal stuff, it's all stuff that isn't public, and he does go into why he didn't do that later, but it's too little too late, and it was the wrong strategy to employ. And absolutely no one can trust him on this, because why is he only coming out against lockdown now? The cynic in me is screaming at me, saying he's probably only doing that to try and get the Tory skeptic vote, of which there is a lot now, even from the older generation. But what he's saying here is correct. There was a lot of fear instilled into people. I know people that still haven't left their homes because they are still so scared of the virus. But it is the easiest thing in the world to come out and say, hey, I was actually against this the whole time. It was just all internally, and there's absolutely no evidence that I was doing this. You're just going to have to trust my word on it. I am afraid to say, Sunak, that I do not trust you on this. I think you have just realised that lockdown scepticism is now a more popular position within the Tory party than it was, and you are trying to get political capital off of that. But when you're pointing at the government that you were a large part of, saying, yes, this was all bad, but I swear I was on your side, it comes across as a bit silly. But anyway, when it comes to the rest of this section, it's things we already know, the eat out to help out saga, things like that. Sunak generally did seem to want to get away from the fear narrative, and, I have respect for that, but it's really not enough. You can't just say, I'm the only dissident, but not actually do anything about it and keep that private. That's just silly. And it gets even worse, in fact. So in the early days, Sunak had an advantage. The Sage people didn't realise for a very long time that there was a Treasury person on all their calls. A lovely lady. She was great because it meant that she was sitting there listening to their discussions. It meant he was alerted early to the fact that these all-important minutes of Sage meetings often edited out dissenting voices. His mole, he says, would tell him, well, actually, it turns out that a lot of people disagreed with that conclusion, or here are the reasons that we are not sure about it. So at least I would be able to get into those meetings better armed. But his victories were few and far between. One, he says, came in May 2020 when the first plans were being drawn to move out of lockdown into summer. There's some language in there that you will see because I fought for it, he says. It's talked about non-COVID health impact, just a few sentences he said, but he views the fact that the lockdown side effects were recognised at all at this point was a triumph. It's absolutely amazing, isn't it? Rishi Sunak appears to be as used to me for getting few and far between wins. Just the tiniest crumb of, oh, maybe they're listening to me, is exactly what we want. And to be fair, this is what we're getting from Sunak with this article alone. But when you're in government and have that power, you really need to use it to some extent. Because just saying, oh yeah, I had a mole in there, and the most I did with it was to have some fine print added to the lockdown manifestos. Yeah, you basically did nothing. Like, well done. Though credit where credit's due, there is a little story where he does get more success. So when the Omicron variant started to rise last December, the dance began again. A Sage analysis claimed that without a fourth lockdown, COVID deaths could hit 6,000 a day. That was out by a factor of 20. But we only know this because for once the government rejected Sage's advice. This time Sunak was taking surroundings of his own, including academics at Stanford University, where he went to business school, and his former colleagues in the world of finance who had started to do some COVID modelling themselves. Crucially, JP Morgan used South African data on Omicron to suggest that UK hospitals will not be overrun, contrary to Sage's predictions. I'm still on the JP Morgan research emailing list, he says. It gives me a bit of a different perspective. In the case of Omicron, it is very different perspective was right than every single one of the 12 Sage scenarios provided to the ministers. That was a vast exaggeration, and Britain would be locked down needlessly. Yet the wheels were already in motion, says Sunak. They had briefed already that there was going to be a press conference. The system was kind of geared up. He flew back early from a trip to California. By this time, JP Morgan's lockdown analysis was being emailed around among the cabinet ministers like Sazmidat paper, and they were ready to rebel. Sunak met Johnson. I just told him it's not right. We shouldn't do it. He did not threaten to resign if there was another lockdown, but I used the closest formulation of words that I could to imply that threat. Sunak then rang around other ministers and compared notes. And it seems as a result of that we ended up not having a lockdown. But unfortunately we do have to now deal with the consequences of the previous lockdowns, which appear to have been just awful. But now we get to some of my criticisms. At any point Sunak could have gone public or even resigned. I asked him if he should have done. To quit in that way during a pandemic, he says, would have been irresponsible, and to go public or let his misgivings become known would have been seen as a direct attack on the PM. I think people would have liked that. At the time, COVID skeptics would have, not COVID skeptics, lockdown skeptics would have anyway. I am not a COVID skeptic. At the time, number 10 strategy was to create the impression that lockdown was a scientifically created policy, which only crackpots dared to question. Hello. If word leaked that the Chancellor had grave reservations or that basic cost-benefit analysis had never been applied, he would have been politically unhelpful for number 10. Only now can Sunak speak freely. He is opened up not just because he is running to be Prime Minister, he says, but because there are important lessons in it for all of this. Not who did what wrong, but how it came to pass that such important questions about lockdown's profound knock-on effects, issues that will probably dominate politics for years to come, were never properly explored. So what's screaming at me here? I mean, okay, credit where it's due, at least he finally came out with it. But I'm essentially being told here that Rishi Sunak will kowtow to the media. In other words, Rishi Sunak didn't come out, resign, or let it be publicly known that he had issues with lockdown because it was politically expedient to keep that to himself. He would have been seen as a crackpot and science denier, all these different labels, and really what you have to do these days is completely ignore that. The media represents a very specific bubble of people who generally live in metropolitan and affluent areas of the country. Think of your average person from Islington who owns property, or Gary Lineker. They're very specific people who will call absolutely anyone racist for absolutely any reason, and with the lockdowns, their NPC programming was, if you don't believe in lockdowns, you hate science. This needs to be ignored because effectively they are midwits, and the big brains and the small brains of the world absolutely hate them and think they're wrong in most respects. Unfortunately, that's quite hard for politicians to realise unless they don't live in that bubble as well, which Rishi Sunak does. And so I'd rather have someone in charge like Liz Truss, who may be incompetent, but on the bright side, she is effectively trying to LARP as what I would like from a Prime Minister, which is basically a new Margaret Thatcher. She might be bad at it, but it's a hell of a lot better than Rishi Sunak, who is basically just going to follow whatever the media accuse him of. That's what he has said there. So finally, I want to go through a little bit of what the Spectator brings up about the knock-on effects. So there's one major factor he doesn't raise, the opinion polls. Lockdowns were being imposed all over a terrified world in March 2020, and the Prime Minister was already being accused of having blood on his hands by failing to act earlier. Surely whoever was in number 10 would have been forced to lock down by public opinion. But the public, Sunak says, were being scared witless, while being kept in the dark about lockdown's likely effects. We helped shape that, with the fear messaging empowering of the scientists, and not talking about the trade-offs. Wow, this sounds like Starship Troopers. The trade-offs are apparent. At first no one asked what all those cancelled NHS appointments would mean. When the answer came, it was devastating. A waiting list that is projected to grow from 6 million to now 9 million by 2024, and there is even further expansion on that. It is said that there is a hidden 10 million people waiting list. So if you add that to the 9 million, and obviously there will be some crossover, but at a max that's 19 million people. That's close to a third of the country. That's about 3 million off a third of the population of the country. Avoidable cancer deaths due to late diagnosis will run into the thousands. Then there's the economic impact. We are short of 300,000 to 400,000 workers, he says. That is a problem. Some 5.3 million are out of work benefits, with many over 50s giving up on working entirely, a tendency that Sunak says was not spotted until it was too late. So yeah, absolutely loads and loads and loads of knock-on effects. But no one seems to be questioning that lockdowns aren't actually effective at giving us herd immunity, and in fact may actually have been detrimental and caused the virus to mutate in a specific way, and in fact encouraged it in evolutionary terms to become more deadly than it would have been if we didn't lock down. And I will let Matt Ridley explain why.
And in the First World War, we did that with influenza. We said basically, if you've got a mild case, go to a dugout and sleep it off. If you've got a severe case, we'll send you to a field hospital full of people, and then on a crowded train, and then on a ferry, and then back to another hospital in London. So in other words, we were saying severe cases will spread much better than mild cases. And that's why the 1918 flu turned virulent in August 1918. Now, I think we've done the same with this virus for a couple of years by saying in the first few lockdowns, if you're only got mild symptoms, just stay at home. If you've got severe symptoms, go to hospitals and give it to the nurses and give it to the doctors and give it to the other patients, because that's what happened. There was a huge nosocomial, that is to say, hospital-borne infection in those early months. And so I think that encouraged the virus, in evolutionary terms, to stay virulent far longer than it would have done. And it was only when we started opening up that we got Omicron coming along and replacing the more virulent forms.
For those of you wondering, that was a clip from the Wellington Project, which I'm obviously a part of, where we interviewed Matt Ridley, and we hope to do more interviews in the future. Links to the Wellington Project down below, and links to that particular interview, of course, are in the description, along with the rest of the sources. But back to the point at hand. Obviously, Rishi Sunak coming out and publicly saying that the government were not fully considering the cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns, and possibly made huge mistakes by going into lockdowns for as long as we did, though Rishi Sunak thinks we still should have gone into lockdown, and to be honest, I think if we were going to, it should have been for a max 2 weeks. There are people in the government obviously pushing against this, and in The Spectator yet again, Lee Kane, who was Director of Communications for Number 10 in 2019 to 2020 and was part of the lockdown discussions, wrote this article, What Rishi Sunak Gets Wrong About Lockdown. We did discuss trade-offs, which already from that point you can see that, yes, Rishi did mention that they were discussed, not to the extent they should have been. He saw it as a victory that even getting the one sentence onto a paper about lockdown was a victory. But anyway, let's see what he has to say. Rishi Sunak presents an alarming picture of what happened during lockdown in this week's Spectator interview, or last week's one. One echoed by lockdown skeptics who claim that COVID policy was a disaster, stoked by fear and based on questionable scientific advice. Worst of all, they cry, the trade-offs were not even discussed. I'm not being funny, but all of that appears to be true. But none of this is true. It is COVID revisionism. I know because I sat around the cabinet table as politicians, scientists, economists and epidemiologists. agonised over the extent to which lockdown would devastate lives and livelihoods. It was not an easy decision for anyone. We locked down because we knew the cost of letting COVID rip was far more damaging to both the health and wealth of the nation, but as the pandemic fades into our collective memory and the critics try to rewrite history, it's clear that the biggest mistake we made was not locking down, but doing so too late. The desperation that is gleaming off this article is very tasty, I have to say. Because the general public will happily admit that they were scared of COVID. That's why they were following the lockdown rules so closely. And that's why everyone was snitching on each other. Oh my god, they left the house to walk the dog. And that's why police had drones in the air trying to catch people out for walks in the middle of nowhere, which, they're obviously going to spread loads walking in the Devonshire countryside. Honestly. Why'd I call it Devonshire? Anyway, back to the article. I vividly remember the morning of Saturday the 14th of March 2020, when, as part of a small team of advisors gathered in the Prime Minister's office, Boris Johnson was told that the initial plan for managing the pandemic was failing. Without urgent intervention, the country's healthcare system would collapse under the strain of tens of thousands of seriously ill patients. The challenges facing us in that first wave were immense. We knew the NHS didn't have enough beds. There was a massive shortfall in PPE and a severely limited number of ventilators. The initial modelling used for crucial decisions we found out was very wrong. Yes, but you're saying it underestimated it. Absolutely everything that's happened post-pandemic, we know, they were all overestimated. A review conducted by data experts recruited by Dominic Cummings uncovered that unless we changed course immediately, the NHS would be overwhelmed within 3 weeks. Yes, I remember the 3 weeks to flatten the curve. The PM sat in silence as 3 scenarios were sketched out on a whiteboard. The first looked at no restrictions, the second at social distancing measures, and the third considered a national lockdown. Only under the last option would the NHS avoid collapse, but it took the PM a week to declare a national lockdown. That decision eventually saved tens of thousands of lives, so not the hundreds of thousands like the SAGE modelling tried to claim. Which is incredible. This is revisionist as well. It was hundreds of thousands at the time. I know, I did videos on it, and we know from Rishi Sunak's article because he gave the numbers as well. It dropped from 500,000 down to about 20,000 deaths. They were SAGE's estimates, and they were the main government advisors at the time. But trade-offs were highlighted daily by Chris Whitty in our morning COVID meetings. They weighed heavily on everyone involved, but we believe that morally, politically and practically, lockdown was the right thing to do. Yes, it was flawed and a blunt tool, but it was the best we had in a very limited toolbox. We desperately needed more time to improve NHS capacity, buy more ventilators, develop drugs, purchase PPE, and of course create a COVID vaccine. Lockdown gave us that time. And even with PPE, we need to purchase loads of it. My hairdresser, my barber's, he gave me about 10 bits of PPE, and he just said, donate it to the carnival we do in my town every year, because we don't need it. And he was using PPE for maybe a couple of months after lockdown, and then no one needed to use it again. Completely overpurchased. NHS capacity, where you had the Nightingale hospitals that, as far as I'm aware, were never used. Ventilators, who knows, and developed drugs, well, yeah, we got the vaccine out and running first, so well done. You didn't need to have national lockdown while all that was happening, though, I can assure you. Or should I say, the public gave us that time. They trusted the government, they stayed at home, they applauded NHS workers, they made the difference. It wasn't these actions we should regret. It was the weeks wasted by a government too purely animus to act. The truth is that we locked down late because we had become paralysed by the fear of the trade-offs. I don't think it was the fear, I think it's just the fact Boris is, or was I should say, naturally actually quite libertarian, at least to the point of saying we are not looking down the country, that is just ridiculous. But then obviously he was in intensive care for a few weeks and then he came out as basically a completely different person. That may have been a shock to his system and ultimately switched him more on towards putting the lockdown in place, which, as Matt really explained before, may have been a mistake. Opponents still say lockdown was a mistake, because it was. What do these critics think would have happened to transmission rates rising exponentially if we had failed to lock down? What would they have done instead? Mr. Sunak says he would have had a grown-up conversation with the public. Yeah, it's cringe, isn't it? But what does this mean in policy terms? Do lockdown skeptics believe people would have voluntarily stayed at home and avoided social contact, as in Sweden, so restrictions were not needed? People were doing that before lockdown anyway, don't worry about it. We saw at the start of the pandemic how nebulous policy caused many problems. A directive was needed over woolly guidance. Or is the actual unstated argument that we should have just let COVID rip? No, I don't think any COVID skeptic is saying that. Lockdown skeptic, not COVID skeptic. Lockdown skeptics seem to believe that restrictions were too onerous, that avoiding economic damage would have been worth the high mortality rates. I mean, look, what is the point of trying to save the NHS if you end up with a massive backlog of 9 million people estimated in 2024? All you have done there is caused a problem, and probably a worse problem, that the NHS will have had anyway. And these Nightingale hospitals, are they even being used? What's happened to them now? I don't even know. You don't even see them on the news anymore. They were there for a week. This callous position would have been untenable, rightly, for any government. Public support for lockdown was already overwhelming and would have only increased had the situation worsened. Now, trying to get an answer from Rishi Sunak on the alternative to lockdowns isn't very good, because the man is just trying to look good for the media. That's basically all he's doing. But I made videos on all this. What's the alternatives? Don't lock down, just warn people, teach them how to wash their hands properly, encourage them to have alcohol wash on their hands every hour or so, whatever. Obviously use soap and water, which they should be using anyway, but that helps to kill the virus off in your hands. And when you have a mild case, especially if they're young people, maybe have a large party like they do with chicken pox. If a kid gets chicken pox, they get the kids together, have a big party so that they can all catch it. Maybe having a very mild version of it would encourage a less deadly version of the virus to spread. Whereas, as Matt Ridley said, if we only allow people who have a serious case of COVID, a deadly one even, to go into packed hospitals and do travelling that other people are banned from, maybe all we've done is ended up making the virus become more deadly by encouraging that type of virus to spread. Whereas then when we get out of lockdown, okay, you get a bit of a rise in COVID cases, but it is a less deadly version of it. I also like how accidentally the author of this article has done exactly what Rishi Sunak was claiming people were doing in government and the media, which was saying you are either anti-science or want people dead. Which just isn't true. People like me were just worried about the long-term effects on the economy, on services, on things like that. And even with the furlough scheme, the amount of fraud that occurred with the furlough scheme is just incredible. I don't think we're ever going to see that money back. And look what has happened now. We are about to fall into economic ruin. More than likely, partially as a knock-on effect from lockdown and as a knock-on effect from the Russian-Ukrainian war, interest rates being incredibly low since the 2008 crash, and of course quantitative easing, which is basically doing what caused the 2008 crash on a much larger governmental level. But hey, at least we saved the tens of thousands of lives that probably would have been caused by COVID. Now we just have to worry about a potential winter of discontent, where those who no longer are dying of COVID but die of other diseases and other issues caused by locking down may not even be buried in the streets, as was happening in the late 70s. And if Sunak wants to do anything about it, well, it's too little too late. Bring on Liz Truss. She is going to be our third female Prime Minister. Let's hope she's more Margaret Thatcher than Theresa May. But anyway, that's everything I had for you today. So, as usual, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.